Jack the Ripper murders, a killing spree which left at least 5 women dead in the East End in 1888.
This silk shawl is believed to be the last piece of physical evidence left from his killing spree more than 130 years ago.
For over a century, Jack the Ripper has haunted our collective imagination as the faceless killer who terrorized London's East End in 1888. His identity has remained one of history's most enduring mysteries, spawning countless theories and investigations.
Poor women were on high alert. Vigilante groups formed in order to find out who this murderer was.
But in recent years, DNA evidence has pointed toward a specific man, and the implications of this discovery have sparked both excitement and serious concern about how we remember one of the world's most notorious serial killers. The Whitechapel murders that shook Victorian London. In the autumn of 1888, the impoverished streets of Whitechapel became the hunting ground for a killer unlike any London had seen before. Between August and November, at least 5 women were brutally murdered in a manner that shocked even the hardened residents of this rough neighborhood. The victims, Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were all working-class women who had turned to prostitution to survive in one of London's poorest districts. What set these murders apart wasn't just their brutality, but the methodical nature of the attacks. The killer displayed what appeared to be anatomical knowledge, removing organs with some degree of skill. The murders occurred in the early morning hours, often on weekends, and the killer managed to vanish into the labyrinth of dark alleyways without leaving obvious traces. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented. Newspapers sensationalized every detail, and the case gave birth to the tabloid crime story as we know it today. The name Jack the Ripper itself came from letters allegedly sent by the killer to the press and police, though many historians believe these were hoaxes. Regardless, the name stuck, and with it came a mythology that would outlive the actual investigation by more than a century. The victims were often reduced to mere footnotes in their own stories, while the killer became a dark celebrity. Victorian London was a city of stark contrasts. While the wealthy enjoyed the benefits of the Industrial Revolution, places like Whitechapel festered with poverty, overcrowding, and disease. The police force was still relatively new and inexperienced with this type of investigation. There were no fingerprint databases, no DNA analysis, and no surveillance cameras. The killer chose his victims from a vulnerable population that society had largely abandoned, making his crimes even more difficult to solve. The failure to catch Jack the Ripper wasn't for lack of effort, but rather a perfect storm of circumstances that favored the killer. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police both worked the case, but jurisdictional issues hampered cooperation. The investigation generated hundreds of suspects and thousands of documents, but no clear breakthrough.
Worked as a barber in the Whitechapel district during the time of the murders.
The crime scenes themselves presented enormous challenges. Whitechapel's streets were poorly lit, crowded, and maze-like. The killer could commit a murder and disappear within minutes into countless courts, alleys, and lodging houses. Witnesses were unreliable, often drunk or simply too frightened to come forward. The local population had little trust in the police, viewing them as representatives of an establishment that had failed them. Forensic science as we know it didn't exist. While doctors could examine bodies and note the nature of wounds, there was no way to connect physical evidence to a specific person. Blood typing wouldn't be discovered for another decade. The police relied heavily on witness descriptions, but these varied wildly and led to numerous false leads. At one point, the investigation considered over 2,000 people in documents, interviewed hundreds, and seriously investigated dozens. The murders also stopped as suddenly as they began.
And as much as we abhor violence and murder and killing, folk hero of psychological deviance.
After Mary Jane Kelly's death in November 1888, the canonical Ripper murders ceased. This has led to endless speculation. Did the killer die? Was he institutionalized? Did he leave the country? Or did he simply stop and return to normal life? The sudden end meant there were no more opportunities to catch him in the act or find fresh evidence. The case eventually went cold, leaving behind only questions and a legacy of fear. The DNA evidence that changed everything. Fast forward to 2014, when businessman and amateur investigator Russell Edwards published a book making a bold claim. He had purchased a shawl at auction that allegedly belonged to Catherine Eddowes, one of the Ripper's victims. More importantly, Edwards had commissioned DNA analysis on stains found on this fabric, and the results pointed to a specific individual who had been a contemporary suspect. Edwards worked with molecular biologist Dr. Jari Luhelinen, who examined what were believed to be blood and semen stains on the shawl. Using mitochondrial DNA analysis, which traces maternal lineage, they compared the genetic material to living descendants of both Catherine Eddowes and the prime suspect. The methodology involved extracting DNA from the old stains and comparing it to samples from descendants whose family trees had been carefully researched. Mitochondrial DNA is particularly useful for old samples because it's more abundant in cells and more resistant to degradation than nuclear DNA. However, it's also less specific. It can't identify an individual with certainty, but rather indicates whether someone could belong to a particular maternal lineage. The analysis found that the blood on the shawl matched the maternal line of Catherine Eddowes, which would be expected if it truly was her shawl. More controversially, the analysis of what was thought to be semen matched the maternal lineage of Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who had been suspected by some police officials at the time. This was the smoking gun that Edwards and Luhelinen believed solved the case once and for all. The study was later published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019, giving it an additional layer of scientific credibility. The implications seemed enormous. After 130 years, science had apparently succeeded where Victorian detective work had failed. The use of genetic genealogy, the same technique that would later identify the Golden State Killer, appeared to have unmasked history's most infamous serial killer. But as with many seemingly straightforward answers, the reality proved far more complicated.
If real, and if it retained biological material, it could be the only surviving link to the killer himself.
Aaron Kosminski, the prime suspect. So who was Aaron Kosminski? Born in Poland around 1865, he immigrated to England with his family in the early 1880s, settling in the heart of Whitechapel. He worked as a hairdresser, living in the same impoverished neighborhood where the murders took place. By most historical accounts, Kosminski suffered from serious mental illness, likely schizophrenia, which progressively worsened in his 20s. Contemporary police documents show that Kosminski was indeed suspected at the time. Sir Melville Macnaghten, who joined the Metropolitan Police in 1889, wrote a memorandum in 1894 naming 3 prime suspects, with Kosminski being one of them. The document described him as having homicidal tendencies and noted that he had been identified by a witness, though this witness allegedly refused to testify because Kosminski was a fellow Jew. Other senior police officials also pointed fingers at Kosminski. Sir Robert Anderson, Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, wrote in his memoirs that the Ripper was a Polish Jew who had been identified by a witness, but that no prosecution could proceed. Donald Swanson, who oversaw the investigation, made marginal notes in his copy of Anderson's book specifically naming Kosminski. These Swanson marginalia weren't discovered until 1987, decades after his death. In 1891, Kosminski was committed to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum and later transferred to Leavesden Asylum, where he remained until his death in 1919. Asylum records describe him as suffering from delusions, hearing voices, and having poor hygiene, but notably, they don't describe him as violent. He lived for over 25 years in institutional care without any recorded violent incidents. This is important because serial killers rarely simply stop, and the lack of violence in his asylum years has caused some researchers to question whether he could really have been the Ripper.
Famous for the dangerous proximity of both wealth and sexual exploitation.
The shawl that held the secret. The silk shawl at the center of this identification is itself controversial. According to the story passed down through generations, it was taken from the crime scene by Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson, who apparently brought it home to his wife as a gift. Understandably disturbed by the bloodstains, she never wore it, and it remained in the family for over a century before being auctioned. The provenance of the shawl is difficult to verify. There's no official police record of it being removed from the scene, which isn't surprising given that Victorian crime scene protocols were nothing like modern standards. However, this lack of documentation raises questions. Could this be the right shawl? Could it have been contaminated over the years? These are legitimate concerns that affect how we interpret the DNA evidence. The shawl reportedly contains 2 types of stains, blood and what appears to be semen. The blood's location and pattern are consistent with arterial spray from the type of throat wound Eddowes suffered. The other stains, if they are indeed semen, could theoretically have come from the killer, but they could also have come from anyone who handled or came into contact with the shawl over 130 years, or even from consensual encounters before the murder. Dr. Lou Helenen's testing was extensive by the standards of degraded historical DNA. He identified specific genetic markers and even claimed to have found evidence of a genetic condition called Kosminski. A misspelling found in some historical documents actually refers to a rare mutation. The detailed genetic analysis was meant to strengthen the case by providing multiple points of comparison. But the chain of custody issues and the inherent limitations of mitochondrial DNA mean the evidence, while intriguing, isn't as definitive as a modern criminal conviction would require. Why this identity is deeply troubling. The title promised you something troubling, and here's where we need to address it honestly. The identification of Aaron Kosminski as Jack the Ripper has raised serious concerns about anti-Semitism, both historical and contemporary. In Victorian England, there was significant prejudice against the Jewish immigrant community in the East End. When the Ripper murders occurred, this prejudice erupted into scapegoating and violence. The leather apron scare, early in the investigation, focused on a Jewish bootmaker, and graffiti found near one crime scene, the so-called Goulston Street graffito, appeared to blame the Jews. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner actually ordered this message erased before it could be photographed, fearing it would incite anti-Jewish riots. Throughout the investigation, there was a disturbing undercurrent of suspicion directed at the Jewish community simply because they were Jewish and foreign. Many researchers worry that definitively identifying Jack the Ripper as a Jewish immigrant plays into these old prejudices and could reinforce harmful stereotypes. The concern isn't about protecting a guilty person, it's about the broader implications of how this story gets told. Will it be used to validate the suspicions of Victorian anti-Semites? Will it overshadow the complexity of the case and the fact that the evidence, while interesting, isn't conclusive? There's also the matter of how mental illness factors into this narrative. Aaron Kosminski clearly suffered from serious psychiatric problems. But does that make him a killer? The asylum records show he was troubled but not violent. The identification risks reinforcing stereotypes about mental illness and violence, when in reality people with mental illness are far more likely to be victims than perpetrators of violence. The intersection of mental illness, immigrant status, and religious identity in this case creates a potentially toxic mix that could reinforce multiple forms of prejudice. The enthusiasm with which some have embraced this solution without acknowledging these concerns or the limitations of the evidence is itself troubling. History is never just about the past, it's about how we understand ourselves in the present. The Jack the Ripper story has always been as much about Victorian anxieties as about actual murders.
The Jack the Ripper murders, a killing spree which left at least 5 women dead in the East End in 1888.
And we need to be careful not to let our modern telling of it perpetuate old injustices. The scientific controversy and pushback. Not everyone in the scientific community has accepted the DNA evidence as conclusive. Several forensic experts and geneticists have raised significant objections to the methodology and interpretation of the results. The first major issue is contamination. The shawl spent over a century being handled, stored, and displayed before anyone thought to test it.
This silk shawl is believed to be the last piece of physical evidence left from his killing spree more than 130 years ago.
DNA from dozens or even hundreds of people could have been deposited on it over the years. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, while useful, has limitations. Because it traces maternal lineage rather than identifying individuals, a match only tells us that someone from that maternal line could have been the source. Depending on how common that particular genetic lineage is, it might match thousands of people. Some critics have pointed out that certain mitochondrial haplogroups are fairly common in populations of Eastern European Jewish descent, potentially making the match less significant than it first appears. The initial study also had issues with peer review and replication. When Edwards first published his claims in 2014, they hadn't been formally peer-reviewed. The later publication in the Journal of Forensic Sciences addressed some concerns. but other scientists have called for independent verification. As of now, no independent laboratory has tested the shawl to confirm or refute the findings. This is a significant gap in the scientific process. Some experts have also questioned specific technical aspects of the analysis. There have been concerns about how the genetic sequences were interpreted and whether contamination controls were adequate. DNA analysis of historical artifacts is notoriously difficult, and the standards for making definitive claims should be extremely high. When you're naming someone as one of history's most infamous killers, the burden of proof should be substantial. What the evidence really tells us. So what should we make of all this? The truth is, the DNA evidence makes Aaron Kosminski a plausible suspect, but it doesn't prove beyond doubt that he was Jack the Ripper. The shawl, if authentic, provides a genetic link that's consistent with Kosminski being at the crime scene. Combined with the historical suspicions of senior police officials, it builds a circumstantial case. But circumstantial is the key word. We don't have the kind of definitive proof that would secure a conviction in a modern court. We have historical documents suggesting police suspected Kosminski, but we also know Victorian investigators suspected many people, often for questionable reasons. We have DNA that matches his maternal lineage, but we can't rule out contamination or coincidence. We have a mentally ill man who is institutionalized, but we have no evidence of violence from his years in asylums. The case of Jack the Ripper may actually be unsolvable in the way we want it to be solved. Too much time has passed, too much evidence has been lost or contaminated, and the standards of Victorian investigation were too different from modern practices. We can build theories, we can analyze what evidence remains, but absolute certainty may be impossible. And perhaps that's okay. The obsession with solving the case has sometimes overshadowed the real human tragedy of 5 women murdered in circumstances that reflected the worst of Victorian society. What the evidence really tells us is that we should be cautious about declaring historical mysteries solved. The Kosminski theory is interesting and deserves consideration, but it should be presented with appropriate caveats about the limitations of the evidence. Science can illuminate history, but it can't always provide the neat answers we crave. The responsible approach is to present what we know, acknowledge what we don't know, and resist the temptation to oversimplify complex cases for the sake of a satisfying conclusion. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains, in many ways, as elusive as ever. The DNA evidence pointing to Aaron Kosminski is the strongest lead we've ever had, but it's far from the final word. What's certain is that this case continues to fascinate us, perhaps because it touches on timeless questions about evil, justice, and the limits of what we can truly know about the past.